Welcome to our geoengineering age. My name is Marvin Herndon. I'm a nuclear geophysicist, and I have some very serious concerns. A large section of the scientific community wants to geoengineer our planet, hence the name geoengineering age. But think about it. When you think about the things that engineers have engineered, they've done it because the underlying science was well understood. That's why we can get in an aircraft and fly safely from one point on the surface of the earth to the other, because the science is well known. The problem with geoengineering the earth is that the science is not well known, and what's more, the people who think they know the science have no idea what they do not know. So geoengineering is something to be very seriously a matter of concern. So I'd like to perhaps give you a bit of background about what geoengineering allegedly is supposed to do, maybe how it came about, and what the real consequences are. Now, the people have forever and ever, I guess, as long as humans have existed, military people have wanted to control the weather. Well, it's nice to have the weather favorable for your side and bad for your opposition. And I think it was Lyndon Johnson, among others, who said, the person who controls the weather controls the world. But our world, our whole planet, is a very, very complicated thing. You may be familiar with the idea of the Gaia hypothesis, the idea that the earth and its environment and the creatures that inhabit it are all interrelated in complex ways, and people don't even begin to understand the degree of complexity. I read somewhere that several percent of your body is bacteria, and these bacteria, you couldn't live without them, and they have influence on various functions, including perhaps your brain to some extent, and this is just one small part. So we're really living in an incredibly complex world. And people want to simplify this, and they think they know what to do, and they don't. And worse, their motives. There are all sorts of motives. For example, the military would like to control the weather. Now, in a way, they did that back in Vietnam, during the Vietnam War. They seeded the clouds with silver iodide or dry ice, solid carbon dioxide, to nucleate raindrops, so it would rain and wet the Ho Chi Minh Trail and prevent or impede the movement of troops and supplies. That was the first step, making it rain when it might not otherwise. The next step for the military was preventing rainfall. And this, of course, has tremendous advantages. If you can prevent rainfall and do it surreptitiously, I mean, you can destroy your enemy's crops, livestock, economy. And there are allegations that this has been done during our time. So how do you stop the rain from falling? Well, it's not so terribly complicated. You put up tiny particles, pollution particles, and the pollution particles get between the little tiny droplets. For it to rain, the droplets have to get together, they have to coalesce, become massive enough to fall to earth. So if you were able to put pollution particles in between those tiny drops, they couldn't get together, and the clouds would become more and more overburdened with water until all of a sudden they couldn't hold it anymore. Then you'd have torrents, you'd have storms, you'd have flooding. And this is happening. And it's happening because we are, and I say we, throughout the world, militaries and their contractors, including commercial airlines, are spraying fine particles into the region where clouds form. And it has one effect of preventing rainfall, but it can be used to manipulate the weather. It can block sunlight that comes to Earth. And there are a lot of scientists in the climate science community that believed that if you have pollution particles, it's going to cool the Earth. Well, scientists make mistakes. My whole life has been determining the mistakes that scientists have made and correcting them. And when you correct a mistake, all of a sudden it opens new opportunities for new discoveries. Well, you have to ask, well, why is the science community, why do they make mistakes? And why don't they correct them? Well, in the first half of the 20th century, there was very little support, government support for science. There were a few scientists who were able to eke out support. For example, Niels Bohr, the very famous scientist, he was supported by the Carlsberg Brewery. And so there was a small group of scientists, and boy, I tell you, you had to be really good to get into that community because there was so little money. And they did. They were very good scientists, and they would get an idea and they would debate it and they try to figure out what's wrong with it, and if they couldn't figure out what's wrong with it, they would cite it, they would move ahead, and they would develop it and move on toward new ideas. Well, along came World War II, and the Germans were pretty sharp, the Japanese were pretty sharp, and so our government spent a lot of money on science and technology so that we could win the war. And it was successful. And before the war was over, President Roosevelt asked for a proposal from his science advisor, Vannevar Bush, asked for a proposal on how to support civilian science after the war so that we could reap the benefits. Well, Bush came out with a proposal entitled Science, the Endless Frontier. And it spelled out the advantages of government-funded science. In 1950, these were put into practice with the establishment of the National Science Foundation. Now, the National Science Foundation wrote the rules on how government should support science. And one of the rules was that scientists would propose projects to be funded. And one of the other rules, and the really stupidest rule, is that the proposals would be reviewed anonymously by other scientists in the field. In other words, your proposal for funding would be reviewed by your competitors. Well, this seemed like such a wonderful idea that the journals, the scientific publications took it up, and then the many or most scientific articles are reviewed in secret, anonymously, by your peers. No one seems to have taken into account human nature. I think of the Spanish Inquisition. I mean, you know, if you didn't like your neighbor, well, you denounce him in secret, and he'd be burned at the stake. And this is really what happened in science. Now, scientists aren't stupid. I mean, yes, they are in many instances, but they're not totally stupid. They realize that, hey, if they criticize the work of another scientist, especially work funded by the government, that scientist might be reviewing his proposal. And they cut him off at the knees, and it just takes a few negative words, and you know, it raises a question. You don't get funding, there goes your career. Remember, universities, it's publish or perish, and the reason it's publish or perish is to bring in grants, and if you don't bring in grants, you are history. So scientists figured out, not too hard to figure out, that they don't criticize the work that's being supported. In other words, the consensus mentality. Well, this is all wrong, because science is about finding out what is wrong with current thinking and correcting it. But to do that, you have to criticize what's there, and nobody will do that. So what's happened is, especially in the geoscience community, they have been functioning on ideas from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and never changing them. Well, I came along in 1979 and published a paper in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of London, where I pointed out that the idea for the inner core of the Earth, inner core is an object slightly smaller than the moon and about 3 times as massive at the center of the Earth, that was discovered in 1936. Well, in 1940, the geoscience community thought, well, this is just iron that's crystallizing, beginning to crystallize from the melt. Well, 40 years later, I came along and said, whoa, this might not be correct at all. If there's silicon in the metal, then nickel silicide will come out. It'll make a mass just the right amount, just the right size, that will go to the center of the Earth. And this was published, well, it was communicated by Nobel laureate Harold C. Urey, published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of London. And I got a highly complimentary letter from Inga Lehman, the seismologist who had discovered the inner core of the Earth. Well, I thought at the time that people would take the idea and run with it, the people with the well-funded labs, because I was kind of just freshly minted new PhD, and I figured they would take the idea and run with it and leave me in the dust. But what happened, it was as if it had never been published. Never at all. People did not cite it, except in a few instances where people I knew had told, as reviewers had told the people to cite it. There was nothing said. And then when my grants came up for renewal, they were not renewed, including the NASA grant that provided the funding for this discovery that's acknowledged in that paper. So it's I was excommunicated. That's what happens when you don't when you step across the line and you criticize the storyline. And I'm not talking science. This is storyline. And so I was faced at that point with a choice. Maybe if I had sucked up and agreed to not step out of line, maybe I could have gotten some grant funding and become part of the community. Maybe. But I couldn't live like that. That's not what science is about. I was too well trained. So I decided I'd do science on my own nickel or dime. And that's what I did part-time. And I've made incredible discoveries because the whole science community is trapped in this consensus mentality. They don't want to step out of line and criticize. So over time I've come to a completely new understanding of how the Earth functions, its origin, and how it behaves that goes beyond plate tectonics. It's a whole level beyond plate tectonics. And other things too, such as, for example, why galaxies have their few very distinct shapes and how those shapes come about. The astrophysics community is also trapped in its paradigms and its fear to contradict the status quo. But back around 2014, I started becoming very seriously concerned because I'd see all these trails in the sky. Now, I live in San Diego, and in San Diego, there are many, many days when there are no clouds in the sky. And the sky is, or used to be, a cerulean blue. It's no longer. It's often blanketed with a haze from these trails that are put up, or that, well, when jets lay these particulate trails made of particles, they spread out. For a brief time, they almost look like cirrus clouds, but they keep spreading until they're a white haze in the sky. And they do this typically day after day across the country and around the world, especially in Europe and in Australia and British Commonwealth nations. There's something wrong with this, very, very seriously wrong with this. Now, this is geoengineering, perverted geoengineering, but people are being deceived. People are being told that, oh, these are just jet contrails. Now, if you think back to World War II, when the bombers were flying across Europe in the wintertime and their engines were producing massive amounts of water vapor, and it was cold and it was humid, there'd be these long trails behind them. These are called contrails. But of course, as engine technology progressed, there's very much less water in the exhaust, and so real contrails are quite rare because you have, number one, very little water in the exhaust. Number two, you have to have very cold, very humid conditions. But see, that doesn't matter because the big lie is that these trails you see are jet contrails, harmless. Now, in 2005, the U.S. Air Force lied. They produced a document where they said there is no such thing as a chemtrail. Chemtrail is one of the words people use to describe these trails across the sky. They're just harmless contrails. Well, this is the story. This is promoted by scientists who are less than ethical. It's promoted by a massive disinformation that goes on through the intelligence community. I hate to use that word. It's an oxymoron. These people are corrupt. Who in the world has the right to deceive the public about the health risks of something that's going on in the air they breathe? On 2 occasions, I had papers that were reviewed and published in public health journals when the editors and the journals were assaulted by a disinformation team with lies and pressures and God knows what they told them. And in 2 instances, these papers were retracted by the journals, public health journals, and the professor editors of each of these journals was a public health professor, an American public health professor at American universities. So you begin to see that there's something, I would say, rotten in Denmark, but it's rotten in the U.S., it's rotten all over Europe and throughout the world. I've seen, talk about pollution, India has incredible pollution problems. Everybody knows that. One day when I was in India, the clouds, the pollution was lessened enough that I could see the sky, and I could see the trails being laid in the sky in India, which already has its pollution. So you have to then wonder, what is going on? Well, this, I think, is perhaps the biggest science-based fraud ever perpetrated. And everybody seems to be in on it except the people who are getting exposed. Exposed to the polluted air, exposed to the ultraviolet light that's being increased by damaging the ozone layer, that are being exposed by our agriculture being slowly and methodically damaged by reduced light, by toxic aluminum getting in the soil from these trails, chemically mobile aluminum. This is horrific.
Can you talk about how you first came to research and produce peer-reviewed articles about geoengineering?
Yes. When I first became aware of the trails, there was no information available. There was no credible information. A lot of ordinary people, very concerned ordinary people, had taken rainwater samples after all the atmospheric contamination. They take rainwater samples, and typically they would have them analyzed for aluminum, sometimes barium also, and occasionally strontium. Now these were choices because there were patents that talked about these things, and so there was the thought that, well, they're spraying aluminum particles there. Well, that wasn't the case, because aluminum particles wouldn't be dissolving in rainwater. What they were spraying was something that, when rainwater moisture droplets approached it, touched it, it would extract some of these elements it would leach some of the elements from the particles into the rainwater. there was reason to believe that what they're spraying was a waste product. Coal fly ash. Now, when coal is burned industrially, the heavy ash settles, but the light ash forms in the hot vapors above the burner, and it used to be allowed to go out of the smokestacks. Still does in India and many places in China. But we have regulations in the rest of the world to use electrostatic filters and trap the coal fly ash and sequester it in lined ponds because it is so toxic. Well, there was a number of people have done leaching experiments, and there was one group in Spain that did very, very meticulous experiments on something like 21 different coal fly ash samples from around Europe, and they would take 100 grams of the coal fly ash and a liter of distilled water, put it in a 2-liter bottle and rotate it for 24 hours, and then measure what came out of the coal fly ash into the water. And they did a wonderful job, and they measured 38 different elements that were extracted into the water, and one of the main ones was aluminum and barium and strontium, but there are a whole lot more: arsenic, mercury, calcium, iron, magnesium. It goes on and on. So what I did, first thing I did was to take the data that had been posted on the web for the 3 elements. Then I could compare those 3 elements by ratios to the laboratory data that the Spanish had produced. Now, you use a ratio, one number divided by another, allows you to not deal in absolute quantities. I mean, you could compare a toothpick to a tree trunk in that way. And so that got rid of the dilution factor, so to speak. And so the first paper I published in Current Science, which is published by the Indian Academy of Sciences, was on the poisoning of the atmosphere, especially with chemically mobile aluminum. Well, no sooner than it had been published, but a disinformation professional wrote a really horrible letter to the editor, listing dozens of things wrong with it, demanding a retraction. Well, the editor was a very ethical sort of guy, so he asked me to write a written response, which I did. And he would have published that response along with the letter, but the disinformation person wouldn't allow that letter to be published. Well, this was the same disinformation person who has been leading the charge on those 2 successful retractions, and who has also perverted my Wikipedia page, minimized and perverted. The whole establishment in this country has been corrupted by whatever forces are behind this. My colleague and I have tried to publish warnings about what's going on in the Journal of the Journal of the American Medical Association, or the New England
Journal of Medicine.
Yeah, the New England Journal of Medicine. The proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The Lancet, highly respected a British journal. They won't touch it. And in none of these cases were the paper ever sent out for review. It was rejected out of hand by the reviewer. Now this is corruption. This is corruption. And there's something horrific about deceiving people about the health risks, something that might injure their health. Now, my colleague Mark Whiteside is the medical director of the Florida Department of Public Health for Key West, Florida, for Monroe County, which includes Key West, Florida. And together we've published something like 16 articles in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. Now, how did it happen that we were able to? Because the monsters, as it were, the disinformation people, have poisoned the well. Most of the scientific and medical journals will not even send a paper out for review that mentions this subject. They're rejected out of hand. But as you recall, Abraham Lincoln is credited with saying that you can't fool all of the people all of the time. And so fortunately we found one family of journals that treats the subject ethically. They don't get just 1 or 2 reviews. They typically send out for 5 reviews. And they're not the mainstream journals, but it's in the literature. You find these papers, for example, on Google Scholar and other places. And so the word is getting out. And the things that we've discovered, Mark Whiteside and I have discovered, is number one, the substance that people are breathing in has the potential to cause lung cancer, respiratory disease, neurodegenerative disease, heart disease. It also leads to plants being killed, forests dying off. It poisons agriculture. You get diminished yields, and eventually you poison the soil. Birds are being decimated, bird populations. Bat populations are being decimated. Insects, including the very helpful insects like the bees, they too are being decimated. The people who are doing this have no concern for humanity, no concern for the health of our planet, just concern for their own greedy self-indulgences. Now, the military and its contractors must be making vast sums of money, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are some fat cat entrepreneurs that are really reaping the profits. The science community, the geoscience community, has dreams of geoengineering the planet. There's a lot of effort being made to make geoengineering illegal so that everybody can damage our planet, not just the military. It's a sad state of affairs.
Can you talk about your use of the New York Times front page article about the World War II data and walk us through that and your convection concept
yes.
as part of this?
Well, this is part of the biggest science-based fraud ever, and it has to be deeply entrenched in the operations of the United Nations, because this is taking place globally. Now, the United Nations has been involved. I mean, this is more of an enemy than you really might think. Originally, the idea was that the United Nations would be a place where differences between countries could be resolved peacefully. But somebody screwed up when they set up the rules for the United Nations. And the rules are such that the United Nations, by a majority vote of the General Assembly, can start new programs and consequently demand new funding. Now, the people, the nations who make this vote, there are very few of those who actually pay for it. So we are being stuck with the bill, so to speak, for an ever-increasing bureaucracy. And it was some time back, back in the 1970s, watch your head there, we have hummingbird feeders. In the 1970s and beyond, that the United Nations decided they would be heavily involved in anything that affects the environment. And so they gave birth to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is a panel that has been preaching since 1989 about carbon dioxide causing global warming. And of course, they're extracting a lot of money by doing that. Well, the science community bought into this. I mean, there are a lot of scientists who think, well, there's just not the evidence that carbon dioxide is going to cause that much heat retention. But they also, the same scientists, don't know what could cause global warming. Well, I do. In 2017, January, I think the 27th, New York Times had a NOAA thermal profile on its front page that showed a little bump during World War II. Well, a physicist, a nuclear physicist at Harvard, Geochemist, saw that and decided, well, what he did was he obtained 8 independent databases from NOAA, and he used very sophisticated curve fitting techniques to ascertain that this bump was real. And he did. It's a real feature. And his conclusion was that that the activities in World War II caused this bump of global warming. Well, when I saw that, there's something that hit me right away. There's a couple of possibilities one might imagine could cause the bump. One is carbon dioxide. But you can dismiss that right away because the bump was a little peak and it dropped off right away, whereas carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for decades, maybe longer. Couldn't be carbon dioxide. Well, the other possibility was particulate pollution. Now, during World War II, I mean, there was massive amounts of pollution. Factories were running day and night, 7 days a week, pouring out stuff out of their smokestacks, the airplanes, the transports, the munitions, massive amounts of munitions, whole cities being destroyed or turned into flames. That puts a lot of particulate pollution. Now, the one thing about pollution in the troposphere, that's the bottom part of the atmosphere from basically below where jet jet aircraft typically fly between the stratosphere and the troposphere. And in the stratosphere, you don't get much motion. But in the troposphere, you get a lot of convection, the up-down motion, not unlike you see when you heat a pot of water on a stovetop and you put in some tea leaves or celery seeds and it moves top to bottom, top to bottom, top to bottom. Particulate pollution would start coming out of the air the moment the hostility ceased, and by the end of a couple of months the atmosphere would be clear again. And this led me to think that, well, this is the cause of global warming. So of course we don't have data on how much pollution, but what I did do though is I got data on coal production, on oil production, on aircraft fuel use, at least since 1986. And I plotted these, again using ratios, on the same curve that Bernard Gottschalk had published, and it just followed I mean, this is QED. Now, quod erat demonstratum, that which has been proven. Now, that's not the whole story. You have to ask the question, well, what is causing the global warming? And very soon I discovered what that was. Particles in the atmosphere, in the troposphere, are heated. They're heated by sunlight, and they're also heated by radiation from the Earth, both in the day and night, whereas they're heated with sunlight only in the day. And they get hot, and they transfer that heat to the gases of the atmosphere because the gases are always colliding with the particles. It makes it warmer than it was or would have been. Now, the way convection works, when you see it on your stovetop, it's because it's hotter at the bottom, colder at the top, and you get this motion. And of course on the stovetop, if you have to have the lid off so that the heat leaves, and it maintains this difference in temperature. Well, I was able to show with a little demonstration where I had a beaker of water with some celery seeds in it, and a beaked beaker. It has a little beak so vapors can escape and it doesn't explode, when I put a tile across the top of it. And in a minute the convection slowed markedly, because what that tells you is that convection depends to a great extent on the difference in temperature between the bottom and the top. So if you lessen that temperature difference by heating the top, you lessen the convection. And a lot of the heat is taken away from the surface of the Earth by atmospheric convection. And so it's putting pollution particles, whether they're jet sprayed or occurring from bad industries in India or China, you're producing a lid, so to speak, that causes it to be warm beneath because you're not cooling. Now the geoscience community, the climate science community, totally missed that. They were trying to equate the difference between the energy radiating from the Earth and the energy radiating from the sun and doing a balance. Well, that's not the whole story. The story is that you have atmospheric convection that removes heat from the surface of the Earth. And if you suppress that by heating the top of the troposphere, you're causing the Earth to retain heat. In other words, you're causing either local or global warming, depending on how spread out the pollution is. And there's some actual measurements that are relevant. For example, in 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted. Now, Mount St. Helens did not put material into the stratosphere, but it put a lot of ash into the troposphere. And there are people who measured the progress of the cloud as it moved across the adjacent communities. And what they found was that during the daytime, when that cloud passed over, the maximum temperature was less. But in the nighttime, when the cloud passed over, the nighttime lowest temperature was greater. And it's the nighttime temperatures that really dominate. And there have been a lot of measurements that can support this. Now, what will the climate science community do? Number one, they'll ignore what I say. They'll try to morph it in some way where they ooze over to something else and try to convince you that there's changes in the sunshine or whatever. Well, of course, it's a lot more complicated picture than this. There are changes inside of the Earth that are producing differences in temperature leaving the inside of the Earth. And this gets back to one of the discoveries that I made, namely that there is good evidence, solid evidence, that there's a nuclear fission reactor at the center of the Earth called a georeactor that is a source of energy and also the driver of the geomagnetic field. And it's not a constant source of energy, it can vary. And there are times in geologic past when this variability has been noticed. For example, some Norwegian scientists, I think they're Norwegian, Scandinavian I should say for sure, were measuring the amounts of lava outpouring from Iceland and from Hawaii, opposite sides of the Earth, over time. And what they found was that there were synchronous amounts. When there was a lot of outpouring in Iceland, there was also a lot in Hawaii. And when there was less in both places. And they correctly suggested the one thing that made sense to them is that the georeactor was the cause of that. Because one of the consequences of the georeactor is it produces helium. It produces helium-3 and helium-4. And this was always a mystery. How is it that you're finding helium-3 and helium-4 in the lavas? Well, the georeactor does this. And people have also noticed that there are seismic trails, if you would, beneath Hawaii and beneath Iceland that go right to the top of the Earth's core. There are regions where the earthquake waves change speed just a little bit. And that appears to me that there were heat channels. And what happens is in Hawaii and in Iceland, the lava is characterized by the helium ratios that are consistent with the helium ratios that the georeactor would produce. I mean, this is, of course, the science community tries to prevent that from being published, or if it is, they ignore it. But there's a lot of changes with respect to our planet. Potentially there are a lot of changes with respect to the sun, and the sun, how the sun interacts with the georeactor. This is a whole different subject than the geoscience community broaches. They're still pushing the idea, begun in 1939 by Walter L. Sasser, that the Earth's magnetic field is produced in the fluid core of the Earth. Nobody's ever found an energy source for that. It's also produced presumably by convection, but you can't have convection in the Earth's fluid core. Why is that? It's like putting that tile on top of the beaker it doesn't allow the heat to come out, so you don't have a difference in temperature, so you don't have convection. That's one reason. And another reason is the core is compressed by gravity, and so a small increase in volume, lowering of density at the bottom of the core is not nearly enough to make that material light enough, less dense enough to float to the top. So I mean, this is some of the standard fare of the geoscience community, and they want to geoengineer the Earth. I mean, if you can imagine how many papers have been published, supercomputer models showing convection in the Earth's fluid core, when it's easy to show that it's physically impossible.
Can you talk a bit about computer modeling and its role in this?
Oh, yes. Well, when I was, just after I received the PhD, I was invited to what amounted to an apprenticeship with two very elderly, very senior scientists, Nobel laureate Harold Urey and Professor Dr. Hansi Seuss. And they wanted for me to understand science and to pass that along, and offered me the opportunity to do that in whatever research I wanted to do for 3 years. I mean, you know, I didn't need the money at the time. I had support elsewhere. So, but this is an opportunity, and I seized upon it. Now, it was about that same time that people started making models. Now, a model is not a scientific discovery. You begin with some assumptions. What's starting and what you want to be the end point, and then you tweak the values, you put in whatever assumptions, whatever mechanism you want to lead you to that result. Well, that's not science. You know, if you're teaching a chemistry lab and you give a student a bottle of unknown and tell him to go analyze it, you don't tell him what's in it, or he'll come back every time with that answer. In a physics lab, you don't tell them what the result will be. They determine what they can determine. Well, with models, it's the same thing. It's phony baloney. Now, the big advantage of models is that anybody who has some computer skills and some math skills can make models. Making discoveries is really, really difficult. You have to understand what is known, and you have to understand, more importantly, what is not known. And then with tedious efforts, you take these seemingly independent pieces of data and connect them in the mind so that they become logical, and you begin to see logical causal relationships, and that's how you begin to make discoveries. And it's not an easy task to make discoveries. I liken it in a way to making a new invention. I mean, you really have to be clever, and you have to be knowledgeable, and you have to be on top of things and have some good insight to begin to make an important new invention. Well, it's at least that hard, maybe harder in science. And there's so much nonsense that you have to realize that you can't. And so models became a way. See, at universities, university faculty are required to get grants. They're required to publish or perish. And often they have graduate students that can do the work for them. So making models became a bonanza because the graduate students can do the calculations, and you can have all kinds of models. And that's not the way science should be. I one time, while I had this apprenticeship with Susan Uri, I one time decided I would try to make a model. And it didn't take me long before I figured, hey, I can make that model do anything I wanted. You know, I could make a model of the moon being made of green cheese and make it plausible, and you get the right compression to get the right density, and maybe a little coat of dust to get the reflectivity, and you add all these things together, you got a hodgepodge that means absolutely nothing. And so this is what the climate science community did. They especially funded by the IPCC and the various governments around the world, they made all sorts of climate models. And the people who had concerns had legitimate concerns, because if you really had a model that was correct, you could run it backward in time and reproduce what had been in the past, and run it forward in time and correctly predict the future. And of course, none of the models did that. And instead of looking at the little pieces of information that give you insight, the bump that Goschalk noticed, and that I realized this had something to say. Well, that's for example.
Yeah. So what should citizens do with Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, Parts 1 and Part 2, and Bill McKibben's The End of Nature, which advances the global warming CO2 hypothesis? I mean, how does that fit into your analysis here?
Well, I think that that there's an even more serious problem. The serious problem is one of grand fraud perpetrated by the United Nations. On one hand, the United Nations is mandating all of the aerial spraying, presumably, and there's some ancillary evidence that suggests that the goal is to melt the Arctic ice to open a passageway. Okay, so the people who are doing the spraying, they know this heats the atmosphere. There's no doubt about that, and the accidental drop of material that I was able to get samples of and analyze, that is the sort of thing that would melt through ice. All that suggests that the UN is in all likelihood mandating global warming. And at the same time, the same UN is saying it's CO2 and you have to give us money to do the CO2. And power and control over your energy use. This is fraud, and what I think is that it ought to be called exactly what it is, and the people responsible ought to, there's a U.S. code, I can't recall it offhand, but basically it relates to the perpetration of fraud. And it allows the government to confiscate not only the assets that were gained as a consequence of a fraud, but all of the assets of a person or an entity involved in that. And that is what ought to be done. I mean, this is terrible, poisoning the air we breathe. You see it right now happening. And you don't see it, these things, particles come continuously coming to Earth, continuously being breathed, entering your lungs, some of them staying there, some of them leaching out, some of them actually getting into the brain. Now, there's a marvelous couple of studies where scientists have analyzed the plaques in the brains of people with dementia, Alzheimer's. And what they found is that magnetite, iron oxide, Fe3O4, is often associated with those plaques. Now, magnetite that forms in the body forms as a crystal. Magnetite in coal fly ash forms as spheres. If you look at coal fly ash, what you see is that this forms in the hot gases as mostly molten droplets, and they're held together by the surface tension of the melt. I mean, you know, drops have this characteristic shape. They have a tail because they're falling, but if there was no gravity, the drops would be spheres. And this is what happens in the coal fly ash. You look at it under a microscope, it's just a jillion spheres and spheres within spheres and more spheres. And spheres means that they were made outside of the body from some process such as this thermal process, and that's found in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. Another study found, this was done in Mexico City where there's a lot of pollution, and they found millions of magnetic particles in the hearts and in the arteries of people. I mean, these are real studies by real people published in reputable journals. And this is why what is being done by the U.S. Air Force, its contractors, and other entities throughout the world is nothing short of crimes against humanity. Adolf Hitler never did this to the German population. I mean, he did some terrible stuff. So did Joseph Stalin. He did terrible things. But I doubt if he would be doing this to the Soviet population were he around today. Now these are the monsters.
Could you talk about your collaborative relationship with Mark Whiteside and Ian Baldwin over the past 4 or 5 years? How do you all work together?
Well, let's talk about Ian Baldwin. For example, we go back to a common source, Lynn Margulis. You know about Lynn Margulis. I mean, you can talk about some wonderful things about Lynn Margulis. Well, she got interested in what I was doing because all of a sudden it made sense to her. And in fact, she edited a paper that got rejected because a corrupt editor. But she got to understand what I was doing. And so I had a really good relationship with Lynn Margulis and her son Dorian. Well, so does Ian Baldwin, because they published in the publishing operation Chelsea Green that Ian co-founded. So I think it was through the intermediary of Dorian, this was after Lynn's death, that Ian and I came to know each other, and we hit it off immediately because we both have a desire to understand and to make the logical causal connections. And so what Ian and I typically Skype maybe once a week for an hour or so. And the first paper we collaborated on was one Gordon J.F. MacDonald in 1962 published a book chapter, How to Wreck the Environment. Now MacDonald was he was an insider. He was an advisor to presidents, a science advisor. He was really deep inside of all of the science military connections, and yet he wrote this chapter, How to Wreck the Environment, about what we call geoengineering. How you can find some process that's a little unstable where you add a little bit of energy and cause a big change to occur. And he talked about how weather modification causing droughts could be surreptitiously done because of just the statistical variation in nature. And so we reviewed this in light of current. Now we're working on another paper that's we intend to submit to a law journal, because all of this really approaches not only the foundations of human understanding, but about the foundations of the legal structure of this and other governments. And why I don't want to get into too much at this point, because I'm waiting for a paper to be published, but I used basically the same type of understanding. I see things that people don't see in science, and I saw something in an international treaty that even the attorneys hadn't seen, and it said lots, and this will be, I'm sure, something that'll. It's like a series that leaves the end of the year. It's like a teaser for the next one. Well, this is the teaser, and hopefully we'll have something really exciting.
And how often are you and Mark in conversation?
That's a good question, because it's frequent. It's frequent. Usually we communicate by text, by emails, and if I have something I want to say, I just send him a text. Are you free for a call? So we talk frequently.
Good.
And Mark, I will tell you, Mark is a lover of nature, and to him, this is what's happening is the worst perversion you can imagine. I mean, it just runs totally counter to all of the things that are important in his world. Human health, health of the birds, health of the environment, health of the whole planet. And so we've done a number of things. Now let me skip back and tell you something else. We talk about the trails and what are they made of. Well, the first thing, I was analyzing the rainwater and comparing that to the data that the Spanish had produced. Then I was finding that snow will trap the particles and bring them down. So if you evaporate snow, you have some of that. And in instances, like in Wisconsin in the spring, you get snow mold that grows as the snow is melting. There's a white mold that's sticky, forms underneath on top of the grass, and the particles, as the snow melts, the particles fall down and get stuck on the snow mold, and we've analyzed that, compared it to the coal fly ash data from the Spanish. So we have some good evidence. Now, one of my colleagues has been interested in measuring ultraviolet radiation that comes to Earth, and we've published one paper on that already.
This is Ray.
Ray,
Yeah,
yes,
this is his name.
Ray Hosington, and we've published one paper already. And not long ago, I lose track of time, maybe a month ago, Ray called me up and said, he said, I was outside. He has a radiometer that's connected to a motor-driven device you put on telescopes, so a telescope can track a star, for example. And so he's got that so he can track the sun. And he called me up and said, he said something really strange happened here. Big trail right across, went right between the radiometer and the sun. And of course the radiometer sweeps across. And I had one time told him in the past, take pictures, always take pictures. So with his cell phone, he took a picture as it was coming and as it was leaving. So he saw the cell phone is connected to a very, very accurate clock. So he had time stamps of the beginning and the end of this transit across and then when he produced the data, lo and behold, right at the time when it passed, the intensity dropped, which meant that the trail absorbed the ultraviolet radiation. Well, as he was telling me, boy, I tell you, my mind was on fire, because ice crystals do not absorb ultraviolet radiation. And so that is proof, QED, quod erat demonstratum, that the U.S. Air Force has lied to us. And we also included in that picture a really nice image, you've probably seen it, that has both white and black trails in it. The white trails come about because only a fraction of the sunlight is absorbed. Most of it is scattered, reflected, so they look white. They look like sunlight. But black carbon, absorbs almost totally without reflecting or scattering light. So that was an instance where they were spraying both with something like coal fly ash and with black carbon.
So that puts the lie to these are just contrails, ice crystals argument, right? That's
no, it just kicks the teeth out of the lie. I mean, it emasculates the lie. It's and it's horrific, because everybody is deceived. In fact, I tried to communicate with a British official, sent a copy of a paper. And the only address I had, though, was when he was a member of Parliament. So the bureaucracy got to it, and I don't think it ever got to the Prime Minister as it was intended. But then what did I get but a letter from the British Business Bureau or something, talking about, well, there's solar radiation management, but that's not happening. These trails are contrails, harmless contrails, jet contrails. So this is the lie the British people are being fed. If you call up the Weather Bureau or your favorite TV station weather person, they tell you the same thing. The lie has been so instilled in people, but it is a lie. And no one should lie about something that has an adverse effect on health. I mean, the air is not theirs to poison. The air is for everybody. And this really gets to part of the reason that we are working, Ian and I and Mark Whiteside are working on this law paper, because this really demands. Now, there is one interesting thing. There's good evidence that the spraying is done by an international treaty. Now, international treaties are sort of exceptional as far as the Supreme Court is concerned. Most matters involving the courts, you begin at the very lowest level and you work your way up through the appeals to the Supreme Court. But with international treaties, the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction. So this will ultimately, I have no doubt, there's a good chance that this will be addressed by the Supreme Court. They'll have no choice.
Yeah. I know where you're going with this.
You know. Yeah. Well, this is we shouldn't be living this way. I mean, this is if you know about fake news. I mean, this is now a real concern with the mainstream media. The fake news, they don't tell you the truth. Well, the Fox News is trying to be more truthful, but they haven't yet gotten to that point where they won't talk about this. Nobody talks about this. But ultimately, this will have to be addressed in the mainstream media, and when it does, it could lead to some serious ramifications. I just leave it at that.
Yeah. Well, and that sort of tees up my final question. So what we're trying to do at Our Geoengineering Age, the website, is bring together the peer-reviewed science, the history, the geopolitics, and build kind of a global conversation ultimately of what I call the evidence-based inquiry into the planet's most pressing yet underreported environmental issue, which of course is what's happening to the planet and to us because of geoengineering. My question for you is, what is sort of your fondest hope for Our Geoengineering Age as a research partner and co-founder of this project?
Well, I think that I would see this as being, if you could use the term, a repository of truth. I mean, there are a lot of people. I think that generally it could be said the one advantage of having a college education is you learn to some degree what is known and what's not known. And of course, the more you pursue it, the more you better understand. Now, a lot of people, they see this and they think, well, maybe these are some awful, micro robots that people are putting out in the sky, or for brain control or whatever, which may at some point in the future have some reality. But the reality right now is what is important, and to be able to bring together the compelling evidence, and you have some excellent people associated with that, if I might, But no, this is really important, and I think that it needs to be a source of, like I say, a source of truth, a wellspring of truth, because truth is, this is the foundation of civilization is based on truth. The foundation of commerce is based on truth. The legal system should be based on truth. And so should human interactions and news and what's going on, especially where our planet is concerned. And it's the geoscience community has, over the decades, literally decades, because they were becoming perverted before the global warming started. And what they decided is that, number one, they're not going to, and this is collectively, they're not going to cite anybody that contradicts the storyline. They're going to pretend they don't exist. Now, I've published more important geoscience papers having to do with the origin of the Earth's magnetic field, the georeactor, the behavior that goes beyond plate tectonics, the origin of mountains characterized by folding.
Decompression dynamics.
Yes, whole Earth decompression dynamics.
Yeah.
Well, so you see, this is, but they ignore that. And so as far as my status in the geoscience community, I mean, I have a less of a status than a newly minted PhD. But you know, fortunately, the work's getting out, and the word gets out. Now, when I'm about 200 years old, somebody's going to say, hey, this guy deserves some award of some sort.
Well, Marvin, this is fantastic. Anything else you want to share before we end our conversation?
No, I think we've pretty well covered it. This is enjoyable.
We have. Well, thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's always good to get the word out, and the one thing that I insist on is telling the truth, because that's what science is all about. It's about telling the truth, and if you don't, you can't progress in science, and if you don't tell the truth, you can't change your world either, make it better.